Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to talk about effective parenting. And I want to start out by saying there is no one-size-fits-all parenting solution. Every child is unique, every situation is unique, and over the years I've taken a few different parenting classes and courses, and what I've found is that there's nothing that's going to work for every child in every situation. So there are, however, 3 things that I believe a parent can do that means they're doing it right. And after I list these things, Dr. Burton can correct anything or add anything.
I don't know that I'd correct anything with.
He is the expert after all. So, okay. So there are, what I've come to believe in parenting is there are 3 things that parents can do right. Do their best to provide their basic needs. So food, shelter, clothing. Give kids boundaries and love them. And I honestly believe that if you are doing those 3 things as a parent, you're succeeding. And it doesn't matter what your circumstances are, as long as you're doing your very best at those, then you're winning at the parenting game. Because parenting is the most fly by the seat of your pants, make it up as you go marathon you're going to ever run in your life.
That I agree with that. And the poor first child, right, is the one that always gets the test,
yes, right.
As we learn how to do it. So I agree with those things. I think that for me, what I'm going to spend most time talking about will be boundaries. I think, we've talked about that in other episodes about other subjects.
Yeah.
But I think that it's actually a very good thing to do with parenting as well.
Mm-hmm. And boundaries, really, it's mostly an effective way of teaching them right and wrong. I mean,
Right. And so I think that is where there's differences between parents because you're going to, each parent's going to have a different value system. And
exactly.
So
yeah.
The steps that I'm going to outline, I think they really fit in with any boundary system or with any value system. Mm-hmm. So I think there are 4 basic steps that I help my clients with. And by the way, I think I mentioned to you this off air that with couples work, I often go into parenting because it's one of the ways that you can get couples to come together. Because even if they're having conflict, they both love the kid and they both want what's best for the kids. And so often I'll go down that path of let's talk about parenting. Mm-hmm. And often they don't work as a team very well together. So maybe as the kind of the overlay to this whole thing is I think parents have to be on the same page.
Yeah.
They have to be a team in how they handle this.
I agree. My parents were once given a piece of advice and they were given it later in their marriage. And they told us kids, we were old enough to understand. And they said that never throw the other parent under the bus.
And I agree. Never.
Right.
That is a huge mistake.
Yes. It could be something as simple as, hey, Mom, can I go to the movies with a friend this weekend? And then Mom says, well, go ask Dad. And Dad says no. And now Dad's the bad guy. That kind of thing. Really what it should be is parents, they need to decide together. I said, okay,
let's talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me discuss it with your father. And then you guys decide as a team, and whatever answer, it's both of you. So not one or the other parent is a bad guy. And I think it's important to establish that early on because with kids.
As a pattern. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because every child, just to normalize this, I think every child at some point is going to do what we call split the parents. They're going to try.
Yeah.
And it does not mean that they're bad kids at all. It's just they're trying to figure this whole thing out. And kids are, they're pretty sharp about who, what buttons they can push and how they can split the parents. And so it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really important for the parents to be on the same page. So here are the 4 steps that I think are important. And this ties into, I suppose you could say it ties into discipline a lot, but it's also teaching it. For me, it's about the boundaries. And so there's a lot of pre-work that the parents need to do to come up with, number one, clear expectations. And so for the child, and this is going to be age dependent because your expectations are going to change. But let's just say, let's pick something. The child needs to clean their room. And I don't know how often. So again, this gets into the individual characteristics of each family. There's no right or wrong. Does child have to clean the room? Some parents would say no, but some parents would say yes. So I'm just picking that as an example. And so the parents get together and say, okay, Johnny, they're together talking. They're not talking with Johnny at this point. And Johnny, we want to clean his room once a week. Now, the clear expectation, see, what the pitfall that parents often fall into is they say to the child, I want you to clean the room. Well, my definition of cleaning as an adult is going to be very different than Johnny's definition of what's clean. I mean, he may take everything, just shove it under the bed and call it good. And so what you do is if you aren't really explicit or detailed in the expectation, you're just setting up a potential conflict. And so a lot of these steps that I'm going to outline in a lot of ways are to help the child learn the boundaries, but also to avoid conflict. So very clear expectations. And you would say, here's what we mean by cleaning the room, and go through whatever steps you want as parents as far as what does it mean to clean the room. So that's number one, clear expectations. Number two, clear consequences or reward for not following through on the expectation. So I hear this all the time, parents often just raise their voice or they yell or they nag, and kids are really good at tuning that out, and it's not effective. And so if you're looking at consequences and rewards certainly work better.
Right.
And often it's just about how you frame it. So for instance, let's go with the example of Johnny's cleaning his room. And so the reward, if you framed it as a reward, you could say, Johnny, as soon as you clean the room, you can go outside and play with your friends. So do you see, that's more of a reward. Now, if you framed it as a consequence, it would be, Johnny, you can't go out and play with your friends until you clean your room.
Makes sense.
So, for giving a reward for the behavior is certainly going to be more effective. Now, there are certainly going to be situations where you can't give a reward and there's going to be a consequence. But as a rule, I think wherever you can, frame it as a reward. So the reward has to be clear as well. So the child has to, understand it. So once you have those two steps, then as parents, you go sit down together because you're a parenting team and you're in front of Johnny and you say, Johnny, here's what we're going to, here's our expectation around cleaning the room and here's what happens if you don't. So the child understands it. Now, steps 3 and 4 are from my experience, some of the hardest ones for parents to follow. Number 3, you've got to follow through. If you say, Johnny, you can't go out to play with your friends until you clean your room, you've got to follow up on that. And he doesn't get to go out and play until he cleans his room. Often the parents will say, Johnny will come and say, oh, please, Mom, please, or Dad, please let me go out. I'll do it after. And you say, okay, this one time you can go after. That's a mistake. The reason it's a mistake is because you aren't consistent, which is the 4th step. You've got to be consistent. And so what you're teaching your children, there's a lot of things you're teaching. And one of this is real world. I mean, when they go to work and then they get paid. That's the reward for going to work. If they break the law, as they're a teenager, well, there's a consequence, something will happen. But I think also what it does is it builds trust. What a lot of parents don't understand is if they say, here's my expectation, here's the consequence or reward, and I'm consistent at following through, then the child learns to trust the parent. Okay, if parent says whatever, I know my parent means that. And so I think it's really important for the relationship as well.
Yeah. And I know Curtis and I are guilty all the time of making empty threats. And I'm sure a lot of parents do. It can be really hard in our family dynamic. It has created a bit of a situation where our kids, they don't take us seriously when we say, if you don't do this, this is going to happen, because we're bad at the follow through, at the consistency.
Right. So there's the problem right there.
Hmm.
And you're kind of acting like a slot machine
Yeah.
because sometimes you follow through and sometimes you don't.
Hmm. And it gives kids inconsistency and
It's inconsistency.
yeah,
And so
and
they're
it.
always going to try and push on you
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
they know, because at sometimes when I push on mom, she says, okay, and
Hmm.
sometimes not. But it's important enough to me. I'm going to try and push on her.
Yeah. So we've talked about this off air before, and I'm going to bring it up because I am
Okay.
sure that we are not the only parents that have done this, where what we'll do is our child is misbehaving and they're
Mm-hmm.
acting in a manner that's not okay. And so we say, okay, here is your consequence. For example, it might be you don't get to play with your friends tomorrow. So a lot of times what we'll do is we will give them an out, I guess you could say. So we'll say, all right, you can be ungrounded if you do extra chores.
Well, it's a hard one.
Okay.
I think that doesn't work very well long term.
Okay.
I won't mention that someone close to me who does that,
Hmm.
but what we're finding is then I think the result of that often is the child, one again, doesn't believe the parent, but because there's
Okay.
always going to be an out, and so they
Hmm.
push. What I think you want to do is try and set it up so the kid is not pushing against you,
Okay.
because that can be really aggravating for parents.
Hmm. Right.
And so let's say let's go with that one. The child's misbehaving. And so that's a little bit different situation than say you're going to do this chore of cleaning your room every week, because that's something you can plan out. So often with parenting, you're trying to do it on the fly. So you're out,
Hmm.
doing something and like you're at a restaurant. So here's a common one. Kids are misbehaving in a restaurant.
Hmm.
Now, the consequence often is best if you can have a consequence that kind of ties into what you're doing. And so if they're misbehaving in the restaurant, the most appropriate or the logical, what we'd call as a logical consequence would be, okay, I'm going to take you out to the car and you don't get to finish your dinner.
Hmm.
And that makes sense to some kids
Yeah.
because you can
Hmm.
say, I'm going to, and I think as far as the out, I think it makes more sense to say, you're going to get 3 warnings here.
Okay.
I'll give you 3 times to do this,
Hmm.
or 2 or whatever. I'm just picking 3.
Yeah.
But by the third one, if they're still misbehaving, then you quietly and without anger, you get up
Hmm.
and you take them out. And you said, remember, I told you you're going to end up in the car. Now, it's inconvenient for the parent and you
Hmm.
might cause a scene leaving the restaurant. It's a very good lesson to the child that you will follow through on what you say.
Right.
And in the end, it builds trust. And they understand that there is a real consequence to their behavior. But I think that you can, as parents, you can do some pre-work, even say with a restaurant situation, because you can, sometimes these things happen often, right? I
Hmm.
don't know if that's true I don't have young kids anymore, but as I remember it, there were certain things that you could almost count on that were
Yeah.
going to happen if you go to a restaurant or if you go out someplace.
Hmm.
Right. And so you can talk about it beforehand and you can say, okay, if this situation happens, like misbehaving in a restaurant, what will be our response?
Hmm.
And in that way, you've come up with a response that's the same. And that way, you aren't going to split the parents and you
Hmm.
each know what's going to happen. And so I think it's really
Yeah.
important to think about, plan
Okay.
ahead. Maybe
Hmm.
that's the plan ahead for the situations, anticipate what might happen with your children so that as parents, you can be a better parenting team and be
Okay.
consistent.
Yeah. So an example I'm thinking of was with my oldest. She was very much a wanderer and she wanted to explore everything. And exploring usually meant touching, which when we'd go to the store was a big problem. And I felt like at the store I was constantly yelling at her, "Don't touch that. Don't touch that. Get back here. Stop running off." And I was that parent yelling at their child in the grocery store. And so finally what I started doing is I said, "Okay, here's the expectation. I expect you to stay with me, stay next to me. And if you don't, or if you're, I think that was it, is this, if you're not staying right here next to me, next to the cart, you're going to sit in the cart." And
Okay.
that was the consequence. And
Right.
it worked really well. Of course, she's older now and
Right.
it's a lot easier.
But you probably followed through
Yeah, I think so. And I think
mostly.
well, it was a few years ago, but I mean, it only took a few times for
Mm-hmm.
her to get it.
See,
So,
and that's a good point that you bring up, that I think what parents don't understand is if they can follow through and be consistent,
mhm,
it doesn't take that long for the child to get it.
yeah.
And
And
that's the trust piece. Oh, mom says this, she's
mhm,
going to follow through.
yeah. And I think another thing too is it can sometimes be really hard. I guess something that we ran into just today, we asked our middle child to go clean her room because we're celebrating her birthday, having a birthday party for her tomorrow before
Mhm.
we go out of town. And so we said, we need you, we're all cleaning up right now, go clean your room. And she goes, I don't want to unless someone helps me. We said, okay, we're all busy right now, go do it yourself. And she goes, no, I'm not going to. And the easiest thing to go to was, well, do you want to lose your birthday party tomorrow? But that was kind of an empty threat because we've already invited
You
people.
wouldn't do that either, probably.
Exactly.
Because, right.
No, and that's the problem, but it's so easy in the moment to just get them to listen and do what you want to do. And so as a parent, I understand that struggle, but I think a more appropriate consequence would have been, okay, fine, if you don't want to clean up your room, you don't get anything in your room. So I'm going to pack up everything in your room and it's going to go away for X amount of time.
So that's a really good point. And we,
Yeah.
did we ever use that? I've known, I can't remember if we used that, but I really like it because you can
Mhm.
say, do you see, see all these things on the floor?
Mhm.
You have a half hour to clean everything up and put it away. Anything that's on the floor, when I come back in, I'll put it in a garbage sack and I'll put it up for whatever, a
Yeah.
week. That generally is pretty effective. But that's one of the things that you have to plan before. You have to think,
Right.
okay, what's going to be the consequence? And so, kind of the typical one is parents will say, you're going to be grounded for 2 years. Or so,
Uh-huh.
they throw this
Right.
thing out that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And so, I think that the empty threats, I would say it's really a problem because the kids learn not to trust you. And so,
Mhm.
really think about, I think, the parents sit down, think about what's our list of consequences or rewards that we can call on.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
this requires pre-work for the
Mhm.
parents, but parenting is hard and time consuming.
Yeah.
So this is just one more thing.
And it's never too late to start. My
Never too late.
kids,
I
my
agree.
kids, my kids range from age almost 2 to 8 years old. And as we're recording this podcast, I'm thinking Curtis and I are going to sit down and we're going to have a conversation. He's definitely going to listen to this episode. I can tell you that
You're
much.
good. Good. So
And
I want to point out another part of this.
okay.
So I think it's still pretty popular. It's a parenting class called Parenting with Love and Logic.
Mhm. I've
And
heard this
you've
before.
probably heard of that. And so this has been around a very long time because even,
Mhm.
I don't know, 25 years ago when I was at the Family Support Center, which I think I mentioned, we used to teach the people who came in, the parents, this class. We'd offered a class in parenting and it was based on parenting and love and logic.
Mhm.
Now, that particular program uses pretty much these steps that I've outlined. But there's
Mhm.
one thing that happened is there wasn't a lot. What we found is it was too easy for the parents to not have empathy for the child
Mhm.
in what they're
Yeah.
going through. So the kid is going to be sad. They're going to based on the consequence, they might be really sad and start crying. Now, what we found, I think we modified it at the time to
Mhm.
include more of an empathy component because we found that the parents were being kind of heartless. It's like tough luck. You made your
Yeah.
choice. So this plays, what I'm going to suggest is plays kind of off Gottman's work, which I think
Mhm.
the parenting with love and logic, he calls it, or emotion coaching.
Mhm.
And so if you combine these 4 steps, expectations, rewards, follow through, and consistency with his emotion coaching. And so you get the emotional response of the child and you don't need to ignore it.
Mhm.
You can have empathy for it. And you can say, I can tell you feel really, really bad about this, that you've made this choice. And
Mhm.
I can tell that you're really sad about it. We're still going to go through with the consequence. And I hope next time that you make a better choice because there'll be a next time. And so you teach them they can change the choice later on, but you can also give them the empathy. I get it. You're sad and you're sad.
Validate. Yeah.
Validate
Validate their
they feel
emotions.
sad about the choice.
Mhm.
But in that moment, it's not your job to go rescue them and
Yeah.
say, okay, you don't have to do that. That is a huge mistake. So That's my take on parenting. And I think it really works effectively. I thought of a book. I love this book, and I can't, and I'm in my home office, so I don't have the books at hand. I'll send you an email. I'll find the title of this book. It's a whole series of books that is about, it's called Positive Discipline. There, see if I just think about it.
There we go. Yeah,
positive discipline or positive parenting. Here's what I like about the book. They'll have different versions, like positive discipline for pre-kindergarten, positive discipline for teenagers. There is a general one called positive discipline from A to Z. That's the one I really like. And what I like about it, I would not suggest that a parent sit down and read it. Mm-hmm. I would suggest they use it as like an operating manual, because you can go to the index. You can say, I'm having trouble with going to bed, for instance. Mm-hmm. And so you go, and I've looked this up, so I know it's there. You go to bed and they're going to have, or you go into the index and it'll say, sleep issues. Mm-hmm. And you turn to that and it'll give you a lot of really good ideas, really based on these 4 principles about what are good consequences, how you approach it. And so I think it's a great resource. It's called Positive Discipline. Yeah. Positive Parenting. I'll check on it and send it to you.
Yeah.
But use it as a resource. It's really good.
Yeah. I'll have a link to it posted in our show notes. And so another thing that I thought of that Curtis and I try to do with parenting is trying not to label your children. So when they're making bad choices, be sure to say you are making a bad choice rather than saying you're being bad.
Yes, I agree 100%. That's a mistake some parents make. Mm-hmm. Quit being bad. Oh, you're so bad. It's harmful to the child to label them. And you're absolutely right. What they've done is they've made a poor choice in that moment.
Yeah.
But what that allows them to do is realize I can make a better choice next time. Mm-hmm. If you label them as a bad child, they're stuck.
Yep. They think they're a bad person, and they grow up with that.
And there are many kids who do that. So yes, I agree. Don't label them, but say the choice you made is not a good choice. Mm-hmm. You have the opportunity next time to make a better choice.
Yes. One of the things that I often say to my kids is actions have consequences.
Right.
And
yes, they do.
Today, my daughter, she was acting out. We were leaving somewhere and she pitched a fit because she didn't want to go. And I told her, actions have consequences and there will be consequences. And I found that in the moment, it's easier not to list the consequence because it often escalates. Because then all of a sudden they're mad about this consequence. So I've said, okay, your actions have consequences. There will be a consequence for the way you're acting right now. And once they've calmed down and de-escalated, and then I say, okay, here's your consequence. And I found that works much better.
That's a good idea. And it reminds me of this other thing that maybe is going to happen with older kids, maybe adolescents. And, they're going to do something that catches you off guard. As parents, you don't have to have a consequence right away. You can say, your dad and I need to talk about this, and then we'll get back to you. It's okay to come back to them and say, we've decided this is what the consequence is. So yeah, delayed. I like that idea, delaying the consequence. They don't need to know it right now.
Right, exactly. Especially when they're really, really angry. And there's been times where, I've done it before where I've told my daughter, they're acting out and I say, okay, you need to stop right now or this is going to happen. And they don't stop. And I say, okay, now it's happened. Yeah. And they get even more mad. And I feel like I just have to keep going and going. And it's just snowballing. And before we know it, they're grounded for a week and they have no something like that. That's just almost unreasonable. And so it's much easier often just to say that way. It's just one consequence for this action, because a lot of times, it can be really hard for kids when they're feeling just so frustrated and they're still feeling that emotion and you're just adding on the emotion. Yeah. Even if you're remaining calm, they're still feeling their big emotion, and it's hard for little bodies to feel big emotions.
Yes. So, one of the important things about these 4 steps is you do it without anger.
Right.
You don't need to be angry. And that's what I try and help parents understand, because lots of times they get angry, but I think the anger comes from I'm nagging and saying, do this, and nothing's happening, and they aren't listening to you. Well, don't you get angry, then you get frustrated. If you follow through with these steps, you don't need to get angry. And I think it's really important to do it without anger. And
Mm-hmm.
just matter of factly, do you remember your dad and I told you here's what's going to happen? So this is going to happen. Hope you make a
Mm-hmm.
better choice next time.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like it. So let's talk about a couple of different scenarios that I think a lot of parents would often deal with.
Uh-huh.
And maybe we can talk about a few tips for some specific things.
Sure.
But we're going to start off with an email from a listener. And she reached out, and this fits right in with our topic today. So I'm going to go ahead and read this email, and we'll talk about some tips and advice for this parent. So her name is Karina, and this is what she said. Hi, Liz. My name is Karina, and I have a situation that I've been pondering since my youngest son has been born. His name is Will, and he's only 11 months old, so we haven't had to quite deal with it yet, but he has an older brother named Daniel that died from a birth defect at 6 months old. I've always dreaded how to introduce Daniel, but also have imagined it would come naturally. As Will gets older, I'm starting to realize we may not know how to do this right. I would love to hear tips of how to bring up his brother without him growing up to resent him, but I want him to remember Daniel and know about him. I would love for you guys to talk about this. Thanks in advance.
So I want to acknowledge that whenever the issue is about children, I always talk with my wife, Lindy. I consider her the child expert, although,
Yes.
I've had children too and deal with parents all the time.
Right.
So the thing that kind of stood out to me is that she had hoped that it would arise naturally. And I think that's actually what's going to happen. Now, she doesn't say this in the email, but I would guess or maybe hope that there are pictures of Daniel in the home. And so as Will gets older, he's going to notice the pictures, and it's going to be easy to, he might say, who is that? Or even if you're going through, say, a family album, which at least my kids and grandkids really love to go through pictures. And so it's going to be kind of natural to say, this is Daniel, and Daniel's your older brother. Now, a lot of parents are going to be a little hesitant to say, and he died, because they're worried, that's going to cause some sort of emotional upset for the child. It's really important to realize it's not going to have a lot of meaning for the child. It's not going to have the idea of death is not going to have a lot of meaning for the child until they're probably 6, 7, or 8. So it's going to be much older. But I think what you want it to be, let's say, natural and I guess matter of fact. He is part of our family, and we talk about him, and we don't need to be silent about it. And so that's the important thing. Don't worry about saying that he died. It probably and depending on Will's age, he might say, what does that mean? And then you can, age appropriately. There are probably many books out there that talk about death. And there are probably some that even talk about death of a sibling. So main thing, don't be afraid to talk about it. And as he gets older, as Will gets older, then you increase the amount of knowledge and information that you give to him. Now, the other part that I want to bring up is, depending on the religious situation of the family, I think you'd want to be able to include whatever religious beliefs you have in the family, because there are certainly many religious traditions, maybe all of them, that talk about an afterlife. And so if that is part of your religious tradition, then I think you talk about that. Try and make it natural. It's part of it's part of the family dynamic, and this is where we think Daniel is, because you want to start talking about that.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to happen. It's going to happen naturally. I think she was right.
Yeah, it'll come up organically.
Yeah,
and at 11 months old, he obviously has no idea, but eventually he will. And I think it's good for the mom to talk about it. And I think it's good for her to even maybe say, as the child gets older, sometimes I still feel sad
Oh, yeah.
about Daniel.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's important to teach kids emotional intelligence at a young age. And
You're
this is a great way
absolutely
to do
right.
that.
You're absolutely right. Again,
Yeah.
going back to Gottman emotion coaching. And
Mhm.
so one of the ways that we as parents teach children empathy and emotional competence is to display it ourselves.
Yes.
And so there is, and again, I'm making an assumption here. I think the death of a child is one of the hardest things, that maybe the hardest thing that parents
Yeah, I would say
ever
so.
have to go
Yeah.
through. And so I would guess that there's certainly an amount of sadness
Yeah.
and grief. I don't know how you'd ever get over the grief of the death of a child. So I agree with you. I think it's really important to be able to express that, because it teaches the child this is okay.
I mean, there's been times where I've been in my office working and all three of my kids are with me because they're with me all day. And all of a sudden it's just too much. And so sometimes I will say, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed by all the noise. I need it quieter, rather than just telling them, okay, stop it. You're being too loud. Explain to them that I'm feeling an emotion, and it really helps kids to understand. Or sometimes I'll say, I just don't feel like being touched right now. I just need personal space. And it helps kids to be able to learn to express that themselves. And it's important, especially the one about space. All right. So that is it. And as always, we love to hear from our listeners. So if anyone has anything else that they would like help or advice with, we would love to talk about it. So next week, we are going to talk about a different side of this, and that is helping kids to be resilient, particularly when they've gone through a childhood trauma. So we're just going to give some steps for some different common childhood traumas. So
it's a good subject, a hard one, of course.
Yes, it is. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.